Can you take your seats, please? Okay, we're good. Okay, we're going to start now the panel. Please be seated. Okay, you can hear us all. Okay. Hi, I'm Paul Noel Chretien, a member of the Public Interest Declassification Board, and we're lucky to have four distinguished panelists here who are each going to give a brief introduction, and then we're going to ask them some questions and then take your questions. So I have next to me Mark Lawrence, director of the LBJ Library. Next to him is Warren Finch, former director of the George H.W. Bush Library. Next to him is Tim Naftali, professor of history and former director of the Nixon Library. And Matt Connelly is seated at the end. He's a professor of history at Columbia. So each is going to discuss an area of concern, and then we'll go into questions. Why don't you go first?
Great. Okay. Thank you, Paul, and welcome, everyone, to the LBJ Library. It's really a pleasure to be here and to be part of this very distinguished panel. In fact, as I look down this kind of murderer's row of people with lots of experience dealing with questions of declassification in the National Archives, I am reminded of my status as a relative newcomer to this world. But I will nevertheless try to say something important here, and I thought that what I could really add to the conversation is to talk a bit about what I've learned here at the LBJ Library, and to talk a bit about how declassification looks from one of the older presidential libraries in this system of 13 or 15, depending on how you count presidential libraries. So first of all, a few thoughts about what I've seen in my now 3+ years as director of the LBJ Library. I came to this world after spending about 30 years as either a journalist or an academic, i.e. professions that entail a certain adversarial relationship and maybe a certain friendly skepticism when it comes to the prerogatives of government to keep its secrets. And I can say that what I've learned since I've come over here has been really fascinating. And I would say I have two particular observations that I'd like to share. One of them is really easy, which is simply to call attention to the professionalism, the dedication of the people who do this work on a daily basis. It's really been inspiring in many ways for me to see the hard work and the true dedication that goes into this work, to find that balance that's been referenced at so many points in our conversations so far in this conference between a desire, of course, that we all share for openness and a recognition that there are secrets that do, in fact, need to be kept. My second strong impression, though, formed across my time as director, is all about the very worrying shortage of resources that are going into the declassification work that we would all acknowledge is so important. I thought what I could do is to provide a few bits of information about what's going on here by way of providing an example of what may, to some extent at least, be happening across the agency. So here's a kind of suggestive case study, I think, of worrying trends. We have, it is fair to say, a truly worrying shortage of staff devoted to the challenges of working with classified materials and processing mandatory review requests. The numbers are pretty striking. In 2000, the LBJ Library had 7 full-time staff working on declassification. That number dropped to 5 in 2015, and then to 3 in 2016. And at the moment, we have just one staff member doing this kind of work, though we have approval to hire a second. But this means, in short, that if all goes well, we'll have a total of just 2 staff members responsible for handling all of the reference, processing, and declassification review requests for our classified and foreign policy holdings. And this is problematic in part because all declassification and MDR work requires double checking. With our current situation, just one FTE working on declassification, this process is all but impossible for obvious reasons. And even when we have 2, clearly this process comes to a halt when someone is on leave, or for whatever reason, we can only muster one person to this particular task. A similar problem applies in connection with the processing of classified holdings. In other words, the review of classified holdings not in direct response to a researcher's request. It's useful to bear in mind here that the LBJ Library has about 500,000 pages of classified records. That's 810 cubic feet. That would ideally be processed and, of course, when possible, open to researchers. Since the collections with national security components require double checking, as it certainly should, by a second person, processing of these collections has essentially stopped here at the LBJ Library. When we're able to hire a second person, the amount of MDR work and reference work will still interfere with any reasonable prospect of getting the processing going once again. So I hope that some of these statistics capture the sense of the declining resources and how they've impacted one library, but I think there are hints in the story I'm telling here of what's happening across the agency. Just one other quick thing in conclusion. I want to touch very briefly on how issues surrounding declassification might differ at an older presidential library. Obviously, we've had some conversation this morning about, well, what about the older records? Why do they remain sensitive? And of course, I get questions pretty frequently about why records are still classified more than half a century after Lyndon Johnson left office. And of course, there are 2 simple answers that come quickly to mind: the sensitivity of those materials and the lack of available staff, as I've just pointed out, to review them. But I think it's worth pointing out as well that the complexity of declassification actually increases as time passes. Most of the straightforward single equity material is declassified or sanitized in response to routine processing or early declassification requests. The material that remains classified, on the other hand, tends to contain multiple agency equities, to address very complicated subject matter of very high sensitivity, or require special handling of other sorts. So older then does not necessarily mean easier when it comes to declassification.
Thank you. So I'm 55 days past being retired. So I'm a recovering archivist. So I was very lucky. Like Mark here at the Johnson Library, very lucky in that it had a staff that was much, much smarter than I was, a bunch of archivists who were many years on the job and very, very dedicated job. But the same problem here we had at the Bush Library. As the National Archives looked for, yeah, Suri understands my plight. As National Archives looked for resources because of lack of funding, as we lost staff, those staff were not replaced. And there was a big push to move classified records from presidential libraries back to Washington, D.C. For us, luckily, COVID intervened, and we kind of redoubled our efforts to getting as much of the stuff declassified and opened as we could, so that as little still classified material would go back to DC for us. And I think here at Johnson, that hasn't happened. That is my greatest concern, is resources. The staff are very knowledgeable. They work on this stuff every day. They know the records forwards, backwards, and upside down. One of the things I'm most proud of, so they know the classified records, they know what's there, they know what needs to be classified, and they know what researchers are looking for. And one of the things I'm most proud of is that when you come to the Bush Library or other presidential libraries and you ask for a card of records, in 10 minutes we have the records to you. I don't know that there are a whole lot of archival institutions, including the National Archives in D.C., where you can sit down at a table and say, these are the records that I'd like to look at, and 10 minutes later, someone brings you a cart of boxes. But, as I said, the resources at the Bush Library are shrinking. Like I said, I was director for 18 years, and over my time, you lose an archivist, they go somewhere else for whatever reason. They get promoted, hopefully, and you would ask the National Archives to backfill that position, and you couldn't. And when your supervisory archivist became your deputy director, and you wanted to promote someone to supervise your archivist, and you're promoted within, you ended up losing two positions: the guy that became your assistant director and the person who became your supervisory archivist. Both came from your hide. So it is a funding issue, because I do think we do really, really good work. Across the plaza from us is the Bush School, and one of their biggest components is the Scowcroft Institute. And General Scowcroft may have been one of the closest advisors of President Bush in any capacity, so we have a lot of Scowcroft records. And there's a big push to get those records declassified so that professors like someone mentioned Josh Schifrinson and Jeff Engel up at SMU, people like professors like that can use them.
Tim.
Classified presidential and vice presidential documents are getting a lot of attention these days. And so too is the issue of overclassification that Matt, I think, will talk about. What doesn't get nearly as much attention, and very much also deserves it, is our national declassification systems increasing difficulties in removing the classified document or digital file from the classified space where it must be protected to the individual researcher. Spoiler alert, this issue isn't sexy. It doesn't play on widespread presumptions about the nature of official secrecy, and most importantly, has a solution that would require additional public expenditures on an issue that won't get you votes in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Arizona, or Georgia, maybe in Georgia because of the Carter Library. To build, I want to make 3 points. To build on what Mark and Warren have said, the National Archives is woefully underfunded and understaffed given the mission it has in the U.S. declassification system. A management study, I predict, would find that the National Archives is now as significant a roadblock to the timely review of old secrets as the CIA, the Pentagon, or the NSA. And I say this with deep frustration for my former colleagues, who are hardworking public servants and are not at fault. The presidential and vice presidential documents mess in the news has highlighted the fact that the National Archives has neither the staff nor the time at the end of an administration, nor the real authority to check boxes deemed presidential or vice presidential personal records that leave the White House by January 20th. You think that reviewing boxes for classified documents is labor intensive. Well, declassification is even more labor intensive. AI may help us segregate security classifiable email from routine email someday. But as DNI Haynes implied last night, the work of determining how much of a US-inspired influence campaign in country X can be released will, for years to come, be the decision of a human being. Release is also labor-intensive. Release is the behind-the-scenes work to get materials from the researcher to the declassifier at the agency that created the record, and then back from the declassifier to the researcher with no spillage of secrets in between. I told you this wasn't sexy, but it is super important. And this is what the National Archives does. And until recently, the presidential libraries were the vital hub of this dimension of declassifying presidential records. But before this process of release can even start, the researcher needs to know the classified record exists, which means it must be processed. And the fact it is missing from an open file in a research room must be made clear. This task is called processing, and it is even more labor-intensive than release, and is wholly the responsibility of the National Archives. When it comes to presidential records, this, until recently, was primarily the responsibility of presidential libraries. Thus, the declassification system has 3 pillars: processing, formal declassification, and release. each of which involves professionals. Having just seen the fabulous Leah Michelle in Funny Girl, perhaps think of it this way. Researchers are people who need people.
Thank you. Go ahead.
This dynamic mismatch between resources and mission in the U.S. declassification system is about to get much worse. Both parties in Congress are largely responsible, but NARA isn't wholly blameless. My second point, the leadership of the National Archives has chosen to reimagine the processing, declassification, and release process for presidential records as part of a gradual program of strangling the presidential library system, which it seems the leadership considers unsustainable. You have just heard about resource problems in 2 libraries. What I'm telling you is this is a system-wide problem that is the creation of a policy decision. There is no time to explain, perhaps in the Q&A we can, why a pervasive green eye-shade mentality at the top of the National Archives has led to the disastrous decision to let the presidential library system wither on the vine. But in the few moments I have left, let me focus on the consequences for the declassification system. In an effort to make the declassification and release of old secrets more efficient, vaults have been closed at 6 libraries where they existed, and their classified records have been returned to Washington. The idea is that having them in Washington puts them closer to the agencies that created them and therefore makes declassification easier. In fact, the consolidation program under the National Declassification Center, which I don't blame for this, by the way, has exacerbated existing backlogs of requests for release and related inefficiency that cannot be wholly explained by the pandemic. To make this consolidation cost-effective, NARA could not hire appreciably more archivists in Washington. So NARA is waiting for those folks at the libraries where the documents used to be to retire, to move the slots to DC. And they are letting their costly clearances lapse while Washington struggles to find money to hire more staff and get clearances for that staff in DC. Meanwhile, the backlog grows longer and longer. Despite this situation, NARA is still pushing to deprive the remaining presidential libraries with vaults and cleared archivists of their national security materials in defense of a failing policy. Those of you who've studied intelligence failures and policy failures understand bureaucratic inertia. This means that this wonderful LBJ Library, by the way, traditionally the most luminous jewel in the crown, the Nixon Library, damn good too, by the way, Bush 41.
Better say something about Bush 41.
Well, I love Bush 41. I wrote a biography of Bush 41. Love Bush 41. Reagan and Clinton are still under instructions to prepare to throw their millions of pages of classified records thousands of miles away into vaults in Washington where there will be far fewer archivists to work on them. Sounds like a classic Washington policy, doesn't it? NARA's hope is that Congress and none of you will notice, or better yet, you will blame the intelligence community for it. My final point. As D.N.I. Haynes said yesterday, subject area expertise is essential for effective declassification and release of the most significant presidential records. At the height of the system, before this disastrous policy was put into effect, the United States government had a system of archival experts on head of state, we call them presidential, records unsurpassed by any national archival center anywhere. In conclusion, starving the presidential library system and separating millions of classified records from archivists with knowledge and clearance does not advance the cause of government openness and transparency. It does the opposite. Thank you.
Tim. Okay. Matt, tough act to follow.
I yield my time to the gentleman from California. No.
He's been out 55 days. I've been out a few years. It gives you time.
All right, so I want to tell you a story. I would be delighted to talk about how technology could help. I actually have a book coming out in a couple weeks called The Declassification Engine, which is all about how historians can work with data scientists to try to address the problem, right, with big data when it's classified. But I'd rather tell you a story about how it is that presidential libraries came into being and why it is the biggest mistake in the entire history of the National Archives system to allow this wonderful, wonderful American institution to pass away. So how did this begin? So the US was very late in creating a National Archive. It only happened in 1934. I can tell you why that is. It's interesting, but let me cut to the chase. So President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, some of you may know, he was interested in building himself a library where he could put his presidential papers. And he had a new archivist of the United States. Now, his name was R.D.W. Connor. And this North Carolina historian was struggling because, would you believe, the War Department didn't want to release its records. They insisted that they had to retain control of them because they said even records going back to the Civil War were still sensitive, right? And they had to protect them. So it was a historian named Margaret Leach, God bless her, wrote to Franklin Roosevelt and showed how the War Department was betraying this basic American principle of accountability to the American people. And Roosevelt reached out to the new archivist and called him in. And they decided that they together were going to take into possession these records, and it was going to be the Archivist of the United States who henceforth was going to be responsible for preserving the heritage of the American people. Now, how is it he got that meeting? It's because Roosevelt wanted his library. And henceforth, during the entire time that Connor was Archivist of the United States, he said that whenever he wanted to get into the Oval Office, all he had to say was that it was about the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Presidential Library. He said that was like open sesame, open sesame. All right, so here we have, just recently, David Ferriero just retired. And so why is it, basically, I mean, they will dispute this. They actually still claim it wasn't their decision, right, that the George W. Bush Library will be the last presidential library. There's no library at the Obama Presidential Center, right? And unless, well, I could go on. But David Ferriero basically decided that it was too expensive, okay? It is a political blunder, right, to give up the one thing that gives you face time with the president. Now, of course, ultimately, it's Congress, right, that appropriates the money for the National Archives. Please appropriate some money for the National Archives. We spend more money on military bands than we do on the National Archives. Okay, and so we've got to do something about this problem. But the last thing I'll say is, I used to think, oh, those terrible, people in Congress, why won't they give more money to the National Archives? Well, I talked with somebody from the National Archives, and they said all those years that their budget was getting cut and cut and cut. They said, well, actually, Congress gives us whatever money the president asked for. So this was actually on Obama, right, to allow the National Archives system to starve in this way, right? So we've got to stop it. Right? And we've got to restore this American tradition.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, question for each member in turn on prioritization. So we've heard in the federal government, there's actually a very small number of senior reviewers who can do classified document declassification. And the sexy documents take more of the reviewer's times, like the President's Daily Brief. They're more sensitive documents, but they're what the American public wants. So we have millions of documents awaiting declassification. Given the limited resources, how should we prioritize what to do first? Why don't you start?
Well, I think the way it's happening now is that priorities are set by researcher interest. And I think there's something to be said for that. I think that's not a terrible way to make this process function. And I think a strong element of that should probably be preserved in any new policies adopted going forward. After all, deciding on priorities is always going to be a subjective business. And who better to make those decisions given the ambiguities around this process than the people who actually are trying to research specific topics. I think processes like the Fruce volumes have been very helpful over the years as well in kind of pushing the process forward as part of a more systematic effort from within the government to make our records available. And someone mentioned this morning that it's too bad there isn't, maybe it was Jeremy, a Fruce process for the Department of Defense or the intelligence community and so forth. Perhaps something like that, if not resulting in actual publications, but at least some decisions from within those agencies, the historian organizations within those agencies to set the agendas would be another step in the right direction.
So in many ways, I agree with Mark. So a little bit difference between the records here at the LBJ Library and the records at Bush 41. Ours are subject to FOIA. His are not. And I'm sure he gets down on his knees and every night, thanks God. But the point is when I first got to the Bush Library, I was director for 18, but I've been there for a long, long time. We said, these are the records that we're going to systematically process. And then 12 years went by and everything was subject to FOIA, and we got, 70 FOIAs or something. I might be exaggerating by 2 the very first day. So FOIA became the system by which we started processing records. And I don't want to get into the weeds, but the problem with FOIA is you don't start with box 1 of Marlon Fitzwater's files and go through box 20. You pull a record out of Marlon Fitzwater's files that has something to do with the FOIA and something out of Scowcroft's records, and you create these artificial files. But the point is, it's what the researchers are asking for. And when we first had researchers come to us and they wanted classified records, they said, well, we got to wait 25 years. And we said, no, you don't. You ask for them, and we'll do a mandatory review. And so we don't know if I should say this out loud, but we in some ways encourage researchers to file these mandatory reviews for classified records. Especially, next door we had the Bush School. And you want it, you got to ask for it. And this is what you kind of need to ask for. And we do, and you're right, processing does help because you have guides. And a researcher can go through the guide and say, this is the folder titles that they have. And we put all our folder titles online. So you could go online and see everything we had. But a long story short, I agree that I think processing classified records, the researchers in many ways should drive that. Now, the agencies do help because they do come in and they bulk declassify stuff, and they've been very good. And I think Fruce is at Bush 41 right now. But I do think it is the researchers that should push it. They're the ones, the records people want to see are the records that the researchers are asking for. And of course, there is the whole mechanism. So a researcher asks for records on the Gulf War. We do have some guidance in-house. We have 2 very, very, very big, very good experts at the Bush Library and a lot of other archivists with clearances. And we do declassify a lot of stuff in-house, but the stuff that we have to send back, it has to be sent back. And you send it back, and you don't know when you're going to get it back. And that can take 6 weeks, 6 months, a year and a half, 2 years. You just don't know. And then you get it back, and it can be declassified, all of it, in part, or most of it with redactions. So it's a very involved process. So if you're writing a dissertation and you want something that's we've got at the Bush Library, you better ask for it now. But long story, get back to my point. I do think that the way to do it is to allow researchers to see what you have and what is classified, and allow researchers and people writing books, dissertations, government agencies, allow them to drive declassification. That way, you're producing declassified records that people want to see.
Thank you, Warren. Now we know where those requests for MDRs have been coming from. Tim.
The JFK Library was the first library I knew that sent in requests on its own without researchers asking for material. I love that idea. We jumped on that at the Nixon Library because there were records we had the public didn't have any idea. I can talk about them now because they've been declassified. There were records about something called the Chenault Affair, which those of you from here know something about, that the Nixon himself was obsessed with this business, and he had his people investigate it. There were some interesting reports produced for Nixon about the Chenault Affair that researchers had never asked for because they didn't know existed. So we put them in. The researchers, there's somebody named H.R. Haldeman. You may have heard of him. He was the chief of. Well, Haldeman had classified diary There was a diary that was published in 1994 by Stephen Ambrose, but there was a whole classified area. Researchers didn't know about it. It was sitting in the vault. I found it. It wasn't lost. The National Archives is busy. We decided to declassify. Now, we didn't have the authority, but thanks to the National Declassification Center, which made it a project, we got the classified, much of it, classified side of one of the most important documents in modern American history, the Haldeman diary, declassified. You can now go and see it. Well, the researchers had never asked for it. So if you leave it to researchers to ask for it, many of your most vital documents will never get into the system. So that's why you need people with clearances to go into vaults to look for materials that are highly important to our history. And nobody does this better than presidential library directors and archivists.
Well, I would say at Bush 43, we don't have collections that are secret, that are so secret nobody knows that they're there. So we don't have that same issue.
If you do have it, that proactive action was very good, and thank you for that. And it has to be added to the corpus of knowledge so the historians know what to ask for. Matt.
Yeah, so you know, I am a big advocate. I've already advocated here at the yesterday and today, you know, for investing more in developing technology for declassification. I was very gratified. I think a lot of us were last night when Director Avril Haines said that this was something that they were going to invest in. But you know, just to give you a fun fact, so the U.S. government, the last time they tried to guesstimate how much we spent on keeping secrets, the number they came up with was over $18 billion. $18 billion. Like if that was its own department, it would be bigger than the Department of the Treasury. And it had been going up almost exponentially, you know. And then they just gave up. After that, the Information Security Oversight Office said that they had no way any longer of estimating how much money the U.S. government is spending on secrecy. Now, that number includes declassification. So they would also estimate what does it cost us, you know, to review records, release them to the public. Does anybody want to guess out of that $18 billion how much money they were spending on declassification? How much? How much? Oh. No. It was out of that $18 billion, how much of it was going for declassification?
500 million?
It was $100 million.
Yeah.
So barely 0.5%. Okay, so the next time somebody tells you, we have to strike a balance. We have to strike a balance between the national security and democratic accountability. They are laughing at you inside. All right, maybe they're not laughing at you inside, but it is a joke. It's a bad joke. We just have to stop telling this bad joke about how we're striking a balance. We're not striking a balance, okay? So one last thing, if you want to see some technology in action that actually works, look at something called FOIA Online. FOIA Online. This is a project of the EPA where they decided, you know, if somebody was going to FOIA records and wanted them released, why not release them to the entire American people, right? So that everybody could see what they have. And they also even show you what it is that people ask for. So these are public records, so why not let everyone see them? And it grew over time, and it's become pretty successful. And there are now 18 different departments and agencies participating. They can't deal with classified stuff because they think the system is not secure to deal with it. Now, what's going to become the FOIA Online? You might say, well, this works. We should expand this across the entire government. We should maybe even make it part of like our system for reviewing and releasing records that are declassified. They are going to sunset this program. It is being phased out. Now, you know, one reason is the EPA doesn't feel like they should spend money on the entire government to manage their FOIA process, okay? With good reason, right? But why is it we don't appropriate money to support that and continue it? Well, one reason is that it might surprise you to hear this, but 90% or more of all the FOIAs that are filed are not by historians and journalists and people like that. They're filed by commercial firms. These are data brokers who file FOIAs to get commercial intelligence. They collect this information, they put them in databases, and then they resell them for paying subscribers, right? So this is another form of corporate welfare. Do you think those people want to see something like FOIA Online succeed? No, they'd rather sabotage it and destroy it, so the rest of us have to keep trying to figure out what information is out there, and we may even have to pay for it to get access to it. All right, so that is technology that works. We should keep the things that work working. And we should invest in developing more and better technology to address this fundamental problem.
Thank you, Matt, and I appreciate the passion. The next question is a two-part question for Mark, Warren, and Tim, because they are either the current director of a presidential library or a former director of a presidential library. So I'd like to ask, how were the staffs trained to recognize classified documents and classified equities? And the second part of the question is, how often did the staff at the presidential libraries come across classified documents in areas where they weren't supposed to be?
Training comes in multiple ways. Occasionally, representatives of the agencies come to visit our staff to provide training. Another form of training comes through annual refresher training for everyone with clearance. I think that's sitting in my inbox right now. Another form of training involves the foreign policy declassification staff here doing in-house training to bring their knowledge and guidance to the rest of the staff. Particularly central to this process is to alert people who are not routinely working in foreign policy documents to what to look for if they stumble across materials that should be classified and removed from the files in the process of reviewing files that are not explicitly connected to foreign policy. So it comes in various ways, which I think is probably a strength of the training system.
It's much the same. Agencies come in and do periodic training, especially before COVID. And then you have another point, we have senior staff have been doing, declass and classification for years and years and years, and they train the more junior staff, and then there's second review for inexperienced or new staff. So a staff member gets a collection, goes through it, and then someone more senior sits down with them and either goes through it alone or goes through it with them, and then finds if there's a problem, where there's a problem, sits down with the staff member and says, this is something you missed. And it's not always classified stuff. Sometimes it's stuff that should be closed for another reason. There's a social security number there, but it's one of the nice things about presidential libraries is that staffs are there for so long that they get to be experts. And then so when you do get a chance to hire a new staffer, you've got plenty of staff that can help train junior staffs, but the agencies are great. You asked about finding classified files in the open files. Well, they're not really any open files in a presidential library. They're all behind locked doors. Some are just behind a locked door, behind a locked door, behind a code, behind a locked door. And from time to time, either a marked or an unmarked document is found. And so you immediately report what you found. Was it exposed to a researcher? Was it served to a researcher? How did you find it? And then you take that document, remove it from the file, and if necessary, you put it in SCIF. It doesn't happen as much now as it did in the early days because more and more of the files are now processed. But there is a procedure for it. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen.
Thank you. Tim?
Same.
Okay, good. And I would say, just to add, I used to go to the NARA a lot, and all the CIA people were astonished at how under-resourced NARA was and how poorly paid they were compared to the rest of the Washington, D.C. establishment. And I just got to say, it's a long-standing problem across as many administrations that I was shocked by that. Do we have lots of, if we have several questions, we could take them now. If the audience has questions, we can go to questions. Yeah, go, Ed.
Could I say one thing? So if you come to the Bush Library, there's one collection you should take a look at. There's a collection at the Bush Library called the President's Daily File. Daily Diary is what it's called. And you think, well, this is the president writing in a diary. Well, it's not. He had a staff member that every day took everything on his desk, the photos he looked at, the people he called, the notes he took on the calls, the classified documents he looked at, and she put them in a file. And then she put them in a box, and she collected that for every day of the administration. So if you looked at an article in the Washington Post, clipped it, put it in a file. If you looked at an article in Time magazine, it went in a file. That collection, much of it's now digitized and available online. That's where you should start in your research at Bush 41. That's a paid political announcement.
Were there written questions submitted to NARA that someone is going to hand me, or are we just taking them from here? Any of the... Okay, go ahead.
Alex Howard, thank you for having this conversation and for your fulsome description of the challenges at NARA. It's unfortunate that Mr. Stern isn't here. I'd be curious to see how he would react. I've had conversations with him. He's very lawyerly. So I have two questions on this count. The first is a point of clarification. Yes, FOIA Online is going away, and I should mention that I'm on the advisory committee for FOIA, and we're quite concerned about the fact that the Justice Department has not been engaging the public about this, because there's quite a lot of records on that site that people should know about, including the requesters' correspondence to the records themselves. And the Congress has not seen fit to have an oversight hearing about that. Perhaps that'll change in Sunshine Week. But in terms of Congress's role here, the nomination of a new AOTUS has been resubmitted in January. Shogun, who used to work at CRS, she's not an archivist. She's never run one of these libraries. If you could make a request to the President or to the Senate, and this advises and consents, would you suggest that they consider another candidate who might perhaps be more interested in the equities that you're describing, who might do a better job than someone who comes out of CRS, who's well respected and certainly liked, and the people I've talked with about her work. But do we need a different AOTUS? Mr. Bradley at ISU is supposed to retire this summer. Is that something that we should expect more attention from Congress as well? And then finally, the fun question. Will the most recent president ever have a library? And if so, what would that look like? Thank you.
Can I just say I want to thank Alex for his service on FOIA and FOIA Online. He's actually more expert than I am on that subject. So I hope people talk with you about that and what's been going on, because more people need to know about it. You know, in terms of like who the next archivist should be, I mean, I'd just like for us to have an archivist. I mean, I would prefer that it were an archivist, right? And yeah, we may be at the point now where we are going to need to have the Senate, you know, say who they would confirm, right? Because they've held this up for many months now. I nominate Tim. I think Tim should be the next archivist in the United States. He's well qualified. He's got great ideas. He brings a lot of passion. So.
Acting one, as she is an archivist. She just doesn't have the full powers.
Right.
But if Congress doesn't do anything and they continue to focus on what a candidate has said in the past as opposed to what they've done, maybe we won't get that.
There appears to be a question from a PIDB board member.
Thank you. I've been trying to put a question mark at the end of it, but it really is sort of a statement. I'll bet out of all the members of Congress, maybe 4 of them are aware of this issue. And that's a concerted issue. I mean, they have a lot on their plates. They've got limited staff. The problems of the day have immediacy, and they get distracted. So is there any effort of all of the historians and archivists and others to focus like a laser beam on the appropriators in the Senate and the House and hit them with a hammer on that? Because unless that's done, you're not going to get the money that you need or the resources for it. But I don't see any effort like that having developed. And I know it's not what people sign up for, and I don't feel it has to be their responsibility, but it sort of is if you want to get it done. And that's where I think you would want to focus, right on the Appropriations Committee members, and keep at them and at them until you get some result, because it doesn't take much to pen in a number, an appropriate number to do that, and then you have to play the politics of making sure somebody else doesn't rip it out.
Right.
But I think that would be effective, and I think if folks here get their numbers across the country involved and start focusing on those people, somebody to put that effort together, that would be, it'd have some considerable success.
Thank you, John. And he is a former member of Congress, so he knows what he's talking about. This is not an issue that most members of Congress are aware of. And I think they would act if we could get their attention.
Can I?
Yes.
I think to some extent the presidential library system does have Congress's attention. The House Oversight Committee, I think it's Government Affairs, intervened in the relationship between the George W. Bush Library, the foundation, and NARA very helpfully to slow that process down. There was an effort to move the museum and privatize it. That's still going forward, but under new limitations, through restrictions, and most importantly, Congress was able to get the National Archives to put in writing that it will not do this for any other library. I happen to know there were libraries queuing up, waiting to privatize their museum in the hope of escaping public history requirements. And that's been stopped, and Congress did it. And the National Archives is stuck now, which is great for America. Number two, I know for a fact that Congress was working on amending the Presidential Records Act. That process got complicated, and I don't think there was time at the end of the session. I hope that given the commitment of the new House to a government that is not weaponized, that we will continue this process of limiting presidential power and protecting records for the good of the American people that was started under the previous House. So I wouldn't say a lot of hope, but I do have a desire to see a continuation of the process. The funding piece, the hardest piece, nobody was touching. And I don't know how you do that. But I'll leave it to somebody like you to try to figure that one out.
I agree. You know, everyone loves the National, well, for the most part, everyone loves the National Archives. We got the Constitution, Declaration of Independence. It's sitting right there on Pennsylvania Avenue. And if you ask a Republican congressman, a Democratic congressman, whatever, they love preserving America's history. I mean, the congressmen, most of them are serving the public, and the fact that the National Archives is the institution in America that's preserving America's records, everyone, I think, in Congress loves that. I do think the issue is that we haven't done a good job of letting people know that we don't have enough funding. And to your question, I don't think the Archivist of the United States has to be an archivist. I think it has to be someone that can articulate the problems of the agency and make known that our issue is funding. We are a professional organization, got a lot of smart people working for us, and we're the ones making those records available to their constituents. And I think whoever the Archivist of the United States is, that needs to be articulated to the public and to Congress so that we can get properly funded. Funding is our issue. We can hire smart people. Even though you're right, in presidential libraries, we get paid, our staffs get paid less. They love doing the job. You know, we're in many ways kind of the island of misfit toys. We're people who with history degrees, political science degrees, anthropology degrees, library science degrees, who love getting into the records. They don't like getting out in front of the public and speaking to a big group, but when you put them with a box of records and they can go at those records and they can get them open and they can serve them up to the public, to a researcher, and the researcher is appreciative, and the researcher writes a book, and in the acknowledgments of the book is the archivist's name. Nobody reads the acknowledgments, right? But archivists do. And you know, my wife's the audiovisual archivist at the Bush Library. You go and pull a book off a shelf in a bookstore, and if it's about George Bush or anything to do with the Bush administration or anything around the Bush administration, look in the back of the book and the acknowledgments. Her name's there, and the archivist, 3 or 4 at the Bush Library that helped that, John Meacham, Jeffrey Engel write that book. That's what they're into it for, and they do a great job, but we need to hire more of them. And God forbid we need more money because you got to pay them or they won't do the work.
Thank you, Warren. Dr. Suri.
So I've appreciated this panel quite a bit, and I'm realizing my own ignorance as a user of the archive, as a continual user, my own ignorance about what's actually going on. So I'd ask you each just to explain to us a little further from your point of view, what are the internal issues? And don't just say funding, right? Obviously, funding is an issue. But beyond that, what I'm hearing is that they're paradigmatic and organizational issues. Before we can solve a problem, we have to identify it. So I'd ask you to reflect on that.
Yeah, and if I could, just jump on something Tim said about the Presidential Records Act. I got into a debate with David Ferriero when I published an op-ed about what was going on with, for example, records from ICE, right, which were scheduled for destruction, human rights abuses. They subsequently were destroyed, contravening an order from a federal judge. When did that happen? It happened right before Joe Biden took office, right? I mean, to me, that is a scandal, right? But anyway, so one thing that he found that I was wrong about was that I thought, when there were reports about how it is that former President Trump would tear up his papers and throw them in the garbage, also, according to this report, that there were two people who were scotch taping those records together again, because under the Presidential Records Act, you have to preserve presidential papers. Those people got fired. And in my op-ed, I said, these two people from the National Archives, were fired because they were trying to do what all of us would want them to do, right? Preserve our history. I was wrong. They weren't employees of the National Archives. And it turns out they work for the General Services Administration. So the Times had to run a correction. And I thought to myself, well, why wasn't the National Archives sending people to the White House to stop them from destroying presidential records? And I was told that they don't have the authority. The Presidential Records Act basically has no teeth. And so, unless we have a Presidential Records Act that gives the Archivists of the United States, some ability to do their job, then this is going to keep happening.
Well, one of the things Congress was looking into was changing, because at the moment, Archivist of the United States has only a consultative authority. And this would give, because they work for the president. I mean, this is one of the things that's missed in this whole story. The National Archives is not an independent organization. It's part of the executive branch. It works for the president of the United States. It's very hard for somebody who works for the president of the United States to go to the president of the United States and say, by the way, we don't think those are your private records, by the way. So part of the issue here is that Congress needs to beef up the authority of the National Archives. And you know what? That actually might come out of this mess. So something good may come out of it. I just wanted to, in response to Jeremy, to say that my experience in the National Archives was that, and I'm a trained historian, just like Mark, was that my colleagues did not care enough about the mechanism of the system. They very much cared about whether the materials were there in the research room for them when they came. But, and it's not a criticism, I don't think I did either when I was just an art. But the mechanism is everything here, and that's what I tried to explain, probably at length. And that mechanism needs help. And the National Archives is absolutely awful at defending itself, for all kinds of reasons I won't bore you with, but partly because they're part of an executive branch. And them defending themselves would actually involve talking about their boss. And it's very hard for a part of the executive branch to go to the legislative branch and ask for money that the executive branch hasn't asked for on its own. So this is part of our structural problem. But it has allies out there. The press, historians, public transparency and openness advocates, and those people don't talk enough about the collapsing system.
Tim, should they be an agency? Should they be made into a...
Well, the National Archives is an agency.
No, into a non-executive agency.
Oh, I don't know. I'd have to think about that. I don't know, but I know that there are fixes you can make to the language that would give the Archivist of the United States more authority than she or he has at the moment. But anyway, that's enough for me.
And I don't know what the effectiveness is having an archivist looking over the president's shoulder and deciding what's record and what's not record. I don't know.
Can I just say, as a point of order, we went in 2018 and 19 to the archives and sat at the table with the archivist and Gary Stern and the rest of them and said, we've heard the president is destroying documents. What can you do about it? And they said, we don't have the authority. Go talk to Mr. Cummings, who was then the chairman of oversight. And then that didn't change. Now, he was doing excellent work to try to reform this. I would suggest to all of you that what should have happened is we should have the White House counsel have a fiduciary duty to blow the whistle if they see records destruction. Absolutely. Because right now, there's no adult in that White House who is willing to tell the American people that we're seeing records destruction and violation of the PRA and blow the whistle, and that we should all be upset about that. And I would push back minorly in one thing. I participate in public meetings at the archives, and our feeds are full of angry people, conspiratorial people, people who are threatening the archivists. They are now in a hunch mode there because there are tens of millions of people who think the archives is responsible for what's happening to the former president. When they bent over backwards to not have this, they pled, please give us back these records. So when you say everyone loves them, I got to tell you, it's not true. And if we don't, as a community, defend them as you've defended the library system, this Congress might try to starve them of resources because they also believe, some of them, some of these falsehoods. And they believe that they are communists. They believe that they are unelected bureaucrats out to get their guy. And if there is not a pushback from this nonpartisan group, then there is a challenge. And so I'd all encourage you, particularly those of you from the Republican Party, to stand up and say, no, NARA is on the side of the public here, not partisans. So I just wanted to clarify that.
And I appreciate, I appreciate the pushback, but I think in the years to come, you'll find that more people than not will support the National Archives.
And I think Warren is right, but I appreciate the comment, and I wasn't aware of all that. I will say that on the hiring of people interested in doing archival work, presidential library work, the comments made over there were correct. People want to get in this field, and at the CIA, we had an easy time hiring lots of people with library science degrees to do our records management. They love presidential library work, and there's a big demand for it if the presidential libraries had the funds. Unlike cybersecurity, where you can't hire people because there's a huge shortage of cybersecurity people right now. Any more questions from the audience?
And there's an archive, I don't know what it's called now, but there's an archive school here at the University of Texas.
Paul, can I just say something quickly about the presidential libraries piece of Jeremy's question? It seems to me the story I told, Warren has told, Tim has told, suggests a kind of gradual diminishing of resources going into NARA generally and the presidential libraries in particular, and I think that's an accurate way to understand the long-term trend. But it does seem to me, for some of the reasons that Tim mentioned, we are actually at kind of an important point, a crisis point maybe isn't too strong a way to describe it, between the consolidation of the classified records and what happened at the Bush 43 Library. It seems as though, you know, some really fundamental changes to the roles that the presidential libraries have traditionally changed are right in front of us at this point. And I think there's some hope among my colleagues and Warren's former colleagues that the archivist will make all the difference, right? There's a tendency, I think, to see the nominee as someone who has a kind of historical sensibility, both in terms of the fact that she herself has been a scholar. Maybe that's something we should look for in someone who's a good candidate for that position, but also is either already aware or persuadable about the value of the presidential libraries as these unique institutions with long histories that really are the points where the public meets NARA, and more generally where the public encounters its own history in a particular way. So I hope that that would be part of that sales pitch, and I personally could not agree more that probably at the top of the list of qualifications for the next archivist would be a kind of dogged salesperson for the agency. And I think that we have a good story to tell about ourselves that should enable her or anyone who would choose to make that case, make it really persuasively.
Yeah,
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Mark, and I'd like to thank all four panelists for coming here.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're done.
you.